affirm that the worst parts, the best parts, this is the best of the rest.
Hello, and I love you, Lobster Johnson. This is Best of the Rest, the show where we take a second look at comic book movies that were poorly received upon release, but only talk about the things we like and what the movie does well. It's sometimes a challenge, but always a good time. And this week we are talking Hellboy. My name is Chris Logan, and I am joined, as always, by the man destined to bring about the end of comic book ignorance, Andrew Williams. Are you ready for this one, Andrew?
I am beyond ready for this one. Chomping at the bit.
Hell yeah. What is your history with this movie, Hellboy 2019, starring David Harbour?
Well, I remember when this was announced, because obviously we all know that Guillermo del Toro wrote and directed the first two cinematic Hellboy movies with Ron Perlman in the lead, and there was a long storied history of attempts at making a third one. Generally came down to cost, and also Mignola and del Toro seemed to kind of be worlds apart on what they wanted for Hellboy 3.
Mignola being Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy, yeah?
Yes. So they were kind of worlds apart, and especially when it came to like what they were trying to do, and like it was a very weird situation because del Toro really wanted to do it, Perlman really wanted to do it, Mignola wasn't necessarily opposed, but just between that and costs and everything, everybody wasn't able to get on the same page. So in 2017 or 18, they spun up this new idea. And that was met with some, I'll be nice and say, skepticism. People were not necessarily on board with doing something different, especially when it felt like the old group still had something to accomplish. Although it had been a decade at that point.
Yeah.
I think Golden Army was 2007, same year as, or 2008 maybe.
2008, yeah.
Yeah, same year as Dark Knight. What a year! But
same year as Dark Knight and Iron Man. It was a hell of a year.
Don't you forget Incredible Hulk.
I did, but I remember those three movies that summer because that was for me when it was finally. I mean, growing up, the age that we are, comic book movies were like you assumed they were bad, and it was a nice surprise when it was good. But 2008, those three movies, I was like, this is a new era. This is, you assume they're good. Yeah. So
either way, it was, I was kind of excited for it because obviously, the director behind it, Neil Marshall, I was a huge fan of The Descent, was really into the idea of that guy getting the chance to make like a really hard R Hellboy, just because Hellboy can lend itself to that. And
did you see this in theaters then?
I did. I absolutely did. It was one of those programs with Regal Cinemas where if I saw like 4 Lionsgate movies, I got them all for free on digital later. But yeah, saw it in theaters. Was decently interested based off of the pedigree, the cast, things like that. I was real into the idea of David Harbour playing Hellboy, and yeah,
yeah. This week was my first time watching this movie. I could say I was interested in a new Hellboy, but I didn't get around to seeing it in theaters, especially after that reception, which was not great. We're gonna get into it. We're gonna talk about this movie, the history behind it, and of course, dive into everything that works in our favorite scenes. But first, I would like to read this review that we got of the podcast that comes from Preston Wilkie, who writes, #Positivity Podcast works. BOTR is a great show for finding something to love in anything you've watched. They can turn a movie that I didn't care for when it came out into something I really look forward to rewatching. I've consistently been impressed by the casually engaging conversations. Plus, they often have inside jokes that work for regular listeners while not alienating those that drop in for the occasional episode. Highly recommend it. Well, thanks a lot, Preston Wilkie. Inside jokes.
Here?
John Leguizamo.
Emerald Energy of Will?
But Andrew, that name, Preston Wilkie, could this be the Preston Wilkie, the co-host of the Level Zero podcast? If you're not listening to Level Zero, it is one of, if not the best gaming podcast out there, covering the entire history of video games. It gives you a nice short bite-sized sample of a specific topic every episode. I sincerely love the show. They just launched season 2 recently. They're doing a deep dive into the history of Sega, which, again, people our age, millennials, you've got to listen to it. You've got to check it out. And Preston is actually going to be joining us next week to talk about Howard the Duck, who says he has never seen the movie. At the time of this recording, I have never seen the movie. I am looking forward to finally watching that and bringing on Preston from Level Zero to talk about the movie and everything that works. It's going to be exciting. You excited, Andrew?
I'm pretty excited. I have not revisited Howard the Duck in some time.
Are we in for a challenge? Challenge, but a good time, like we like to say?
Sure.
All right, so look forward to that. Between now and then, you know what? When you finish listening to this episode, go check out Level Zero if you haven't already. Download one of their episodes. Take a listen to Preston and his co-host Greg. Wonderful show. Can't recommend it enough. And then come back next week for Howard the Duck. But this week, it's all about Hellboy. Again, the 2019 one that released on April 12th. This movie was made on a budget of $50 million. At the box office, it just brings in $55 million. That is a certified bomb. That's losing money for the studio. And critically, just an 18% on Rotten Tomatoes. Also, you could use the term bomb there.
Yes. Needless to say, I don't think you could say that this movie impressed on any level at the time it was released.
Definitely not. Let's do a quick comparison to those Del Toro movies. The first Hellboy comes out in 2004 on a budget of just over $65 million, and it only brings in $99 million. It's not a huge hit, but it does technically make money, and it warrants a sequel. Hellboy 2, like we mentioned, came out in 2008. That one had a slightly larger budget of $85 million, and it made $168 million at the box office. So now that is a little bit more profitable, but neither of those movies are smash hits. And that kind of contributes to Hellboy 3 never materializing. The studio wasn't exactly excited. I don't think they felt like they had a massive franchise on their hands. They know it can make money, but with those budgets increasing, it gets harder and harder to continue to bring those profits in. And that, of course, contributed, amongst many other things that you've mentioned already, to Hellboy 3 just never materializing with Del Toro and Ron Perlman.
Yeah, the rumor was the budget they wanted for 3 could have been upwards of 100 to 150 million, and with that, there's no way. Based off you'd be talking the movie would cost as much as the second movie made, and that's just asking a lot of a studio for, at that point, would have been a 10-year gap. So definitely a lot of factors, but that cost is definitely part of it. So interesting that this movie is actually made cheaper than both of the others.
Yeah, they were hedging their bets a little bit. They know that it's a proven property, but not necessarily proven to be a smash hit. And plus, it's a big ask of audiences to change creative teams and a cast when the originals were so beloved. But you know what's funny, Andrew? When they announced this in 2019, everybody was like, well, why don't you just make Hellboy 3? Why don't you just have Ron Perlman come back and Del Toro? Well, one reason that people don't talk about, you mentioned 2019, this is over a decade after Hellboy 2. Andrew, do you know how old Ron Perlman is?
I mean, he's got to be, pushing 70?
He's 71.
Right.
I mean, here in the year 2021. So yeah, he was approaching 70 in 2019. The man was born in 1950. So look, I know that he's got, prosthetics and kind of fake muscles when he plays Hellboy, but at some point, I mean, he's got to hang up the horns. Like, inevitably, if you're going to make more Hellboy movies, you've got to accept that someone else is going to be playing the lead role. But you know what's interesting? You mentioned, it's a smaller budget than those first two. But with this franchise being proven to kind of struggle to be a smash hit, it is so bizarre to me that this is a rated R movie. I didn't know it was rated R until I started watching the movie. I never realized that. But it lets you know very early on that you're watching a rated R movie, and it does not let up. But that just makes it that much harder to turn a profit at the box office.
Right. It's on one hand, I get it. I think this is something that Mignola kind of was also wanting, but at the same time, like, when you're talking this kind of budget with this kind of track record, you're kneecapping yourself already by kind of restricting it even more. And, maybe people will say that, the ratings shouldn't matter if it's going to make money. But I'm like, look at the highest grossing R-rated films of all time versus like the highest grossing like superhero films of all time. There's very little crossover there outside your exceptions, kind of like Deadpool. But Deadpool had a lot more going for it than this did.
Sure. Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely.
It's tough to draw that comparison. And like I said, if this was the direction they wanted to go, I respect that. But I think it definitely had a factor.
Now, Andrew, we say this every episode, or at least I do. You're a comic book expert. You seemingly know every single comic book that's out there. It kind of blows my mind. Your encyclopedic knowledge and recall of all things comic books, but specifically, you love Hellboy. I know you're a very big fan of the comic Hellboy. Yeah,
I am.
You have many leather-bound books.
I do. I have all 7 Hellboy library editions, which are giant, oversized, cloth-bound hardcovers, which I kind of hate because they're so hard to read. They're like these tomes. It's difficult to even like. I think I might get the paperback soon because I'm just like, these are not functional for reading whatsoever.
Well, every episode we like to get around to the question of how does the movie function as an adaptation of the character, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one. We're gonna save it though.
Yeah. That's. I might need some time to gather my thoughts. But
this movie was written by Andrew Cosby. He's the only credited writer of the movie, and he is not traditionally a writer of films, a screenwriter. He is the co-founder of Boom Studios, which I think is pretty cool. I'm a big fan of a lot of books from Boom. They're really known. They're a very small publisher in the world of comic books, and they're mostly known for their licensed books. I read their 28 Days Later comic, which I thought was excellent. But a lot of licensed movie spinoffs and TV show spinoffs is kind of what they're known for.
Couple of creator-owned things too. I know Mark Waid had Irredeemable and a few things like that were some interesting takes on like the evil Superman trope, and I think even Grant Morrison's dipped his toes in a few times. But yeah, definitely on the scale of American publishers is probably 5th at best after everybody else. But
So as far as things that Andrew Cosby has actually written, like I said, nothing really in movies and TV. Have you read any of his books, Andrew? Is he a big name in comics?
I mean, I was a bit familiar with the TV show he co-created, Eureka, which was a show that was on sci-fi that he co-created. He was one of the co-creators of that. He's done a lot of things where it feels like he's been more responsible for like ushering things into existence than it is more of like writing things himself. It's a lot more production based, it sounds, than writing. So not hugely familiar with his work as a writer, far more just kind of sounding like I've just benefited from the things that he's helped come into existence.
Gotcha. He gets the sole credit for this movie. However, there were other scripts and revisions and possible small influence on this script by Mike Mignola himself and Christopher Golden, who is also from the comic book world. But the point is, no screenwriters are responsible for what we get in this movie.
Right. That's very... And, Christopher Golden is... I'm a little bit more familiar with Christopher Golden because he's actually co-written some stuff with Mike Mignola before. He's done some prose novels. Father Gaetano's Puppet Catechism. That's an easy to say title. A lot of the Baltimore stuff that he's done with Mike Mignola. So he's worked with Mignola before. They have a really good relationship, but it's almost all comics or prose. And Mignola himself, obviously, again, huge fan. Like, getting to meet him was an awesome experience.
Was that at Comic Palooza?
It was. It's back when you had to do interviews in person.
Gotcha. I got to meet him once as well. I've got his signature on a couple of comics. I think I have a Hellboy Batman crossover that he signed, so... Nice guy from my 30 seconds I got to know him.
Most of the time, people have only nice things to say about him. Great creator, responsible for Hellboy, obviously, and then tons of others, including our favorite Rocket Raccoon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, who knew that? I asked him once. I was like, did you ever see that guy become popular? And he was like, no. It's like, of course not. But yeah, so Andrew Cosby sounds very much like he's just a comics to film kind of guy. Like, that feels like that's his spot, really, is kind of getting from comics to movies. And then Golden and Mignola, again, huge fans, but like outside maybe some limited credits, not a whole lot of screen experience amongst these guys, which is why I can see why if anybody was going to get the credit, it was Cosby. just because that's kind of been his spot. But overall, yeah, it's an interesting decision, and that's that is what it is at the end of the day. I mean, that's really the only way to put it.
Now, you mentioned already, this movie is directed by Neil Marshall. Now, he's known for movies like Dog Soldiers, probably his first significant movie, a very independent, small horror movie, but then really breaks through with The Descent, which is a fantastic horror movie, one of probably my favorites of all time. Very, very good. Additionally, he also made a movie that some people might be familiar with called Doomsday, which is, I've also seen, it's not as good as The Descent, I'll say that, but it is a bonkers movie. Have you seen Doomsday, Andrew?
I feel like no, because I feel like I would remember if it were bonkers.
Okay, so let me describe it to you. It's like post-apocalyptic. It's part Mad Max. There's a lot of vehicles involved. It's part zombie movie. There's like an infection going on and people getting like real rabid. And then it's like halfway through the movie, it becomes like a medieval Knights and Dragons type movie. It like I said, it's bonkers.
I'm gonna have to watch
how it connects from one to the other. You just have to watch it to find out.
Right.
It's I can't say I recommend the movie. I don't think it's that good, but it's interesting. Beyond those movies, he's also has some credits in the TV world. A couple episodes of Game of Thrones.
Where he's, I think, gained some definite
little more clout.
Some strong credits there. A little clout there. Yes, that's the good word. But like Game of Thrones, those 2 episodes I think were pretty well received.
Constantine, Hannibal, Lost in Space on Netflix.
Black Sails, Westworld. I mean, he's gotten around there with TV.
But yeah, with that horror background and the direction they're taking Hellboy and R-rated, I think it makes total sense to cast him or to hire him as director.
No, I agree. It's when they, the guy from The Descent making a Hellboy movie, I was like, dude, hell yeah. Like, it very much felt like Mignola was kind of getting more of what he wanted, which was like, I want more of the horror. I want more of like the deep lore stuff. Kind of getting away, because the way it kind of breaks down is Hellboy is very much a pretty strong adaptation, whereas Hellboy 2 feels a lot more like we're filtering Hellboy through Del Toro's lens.
Yeah, it's very much a Del Toro movie that happens to star Hellboy characters.
Hellboy. And then with this one, it felt like, and that's why I was always kind of okay with moving away from that, because reading and stuff with Mignola over the years, you could really tell that he was kind of over it. He was kind of like, I get it. You guys really like him, but I'd really like to take it another way. And he was also tired of getting asked about it. Like, I remember when I had a chance to interview him, one of the first things this old friend of mine named Fabian said, because he wrote comics for a while and he was a huge fan, he was like, for the love of God, do not ask him about Hellboy 3. You will see all of the interest drain out of his face because he just is over it. And I was like, all right. So the questions I passed along to my friends was like, these questions, also don't ask him about Hellboy 3. And then like the guys right before them like led with Hellboy 3, and you could just see that he was like, ugh. But so with Neil Marshall coming on board, like I was like, man, this sounds like Mignola's kind of getting what he wants, and that was nice to see. It was a good feeling to be like the creator is kind of seeing more of what he wants from his property. The final result notwithstanding, but yeah.
Well,
it was.
Andrew, we're here to talk about the final result.
We are.
Let's jump into it. The demonic Hellboy works for the BPRD, a secret organization tasked with keeping the supernatural monsters of the world at bay. Because he himself could be considered a monster, Hellboy is often questioning his true purpose in the world, despite his adoptive father's tough love and insistence that he is a good man. However, when the ancient evil blood queen Vivienne Nimue resurfaces, she tempts Hellboy more than ever to follow his destiny in bringing about the apocalypse. Once Hellboy wields the fabled sword Excalibur and grows more powerful, his teammates, Ben Daimo and Alice Monaghan, can only hope he chooses to continue the fight against evil.
It's a lot happening there.
I stripped that story down as much as I could. There's a lot of side stories and branches.
There is.
We'll jump in. It's a very dense 2-hour movie.
Dense movie. It's very crazy.
Well, let's talk about the cast first. We'll get to some more specifics a little bit later, but let's talk about who's in this movie. And like we always do, we're going to start at the top with the best casting and best performance of the movie. We like to recognize one person who goes above and beyond the call of duty to elevate the quality of the entire film with their performance. We recognize that person by giving them the Mark Strong Award. Andrew, who gets your Mark Strong Award for Hellboy?
I am going to go ahead and give it to David Harbour as Hellboy. I think he was really into this. He seemed very hyped for being a part of this movie, and I think he's given it his all. I think if you're going to say there's failings in this movie, not that you should, #Positivity Podcast, but I don't think it rests on him. His casting, his look even, I think the look is pretty good. We're looking pretty classic, just a little bit more disheveled maybe. Because Ron Perlman actually looked pretty well kept for a half demon. But yeah, I like what he's doing here. He's playing it with that kind of insecurity of his role in the universe, basically. Like, he knows what his destiny is supposed to be, but he doesn't really like it. And he just doesn't really like the idea that everything in his life might be preordained. So he's trying to find that balance and deal with those insecurities. And like I said, Harbour has given it his all. And I like David Harbour. He's a good actor. Obviously, Stranger Things had blown up right around the same time. So I was pretty into the idea of him taking this on. And yeah, I think it works. I think the casting of David Harbour as Hellboy is a great choice.
I agree 100%. He also gets my Mark Strong Award. I think he does an excellent job in this movie. And even from day one, I mean, when this movie's announced, the internet, if you will, the internet collective, was like, we don't need a new Hellboy. We don't need a reboot. We have a good one. Make a sequel. But whenever David Harbour was announced, I think the general consensus was like, well, if you have to reboot it, yeah, that's a good choice. I mean, I think immediately everyone could see David Harbour as Hellboy. They're like, oh, okay, I don't like that this movie's happening, but if it is happening, yeah, that's a pretty good way. It was kind of undeniable that it makes a lot of sense. And then when you see the movie, it's spot on. I mean, yeah, you said he looks the part. You know, they do a few things to differentiate it from Ron Perlman's because it is a reboot, so they always like to do that. Ron Perlman's Hellboy, you know, his hair is usually pulled back, and in this one, David Harbour's hair is usually a little more, like I said, disheveled, hanging down, kind of stringy, maybe only part of it's pulled back. He looks a lot rougher. I mean, he looks kind of ugly, like his face, he's got scars and stuff. He looks like a demon. The horns, they're still shaved down, but they just look rougher, more, edgy, not quite so smooth. He just wears the jacket for the most part. He's not totally covered in like t-shirts and clothes and stuff. Just kind of that ragged trench coat. Looks great. Even, talking about like comparing it to the comics, like his lower jaw sticks out a little bit farther, just like it does in the comic book, which was a cool little touch. I don't know if that's just naturally David Harbour or that's makeup, whatever, but even so, like something that specific, his eyes look really rad. I love the look and love the performance. I think he is really funny. He has some of the funniest lines of the movie. I think he handles the torment of the character very well. I also think part of Hellboy a little bit when he's compared to other people on the team is that he's maybe not dumb, but a bit of a goof, maybe a little bit slower, a little bit more brute force than brains, right?
Rough around the edges.
Yes, I think he plays all of that very well. Like maybe I don't figure out as fast as you, but I can punch you twice as hard. Like he can make up for it with his brute strength, and I think he plays all that very well. It's just awesome. Very good performance. I agree 100%.
Yeah, I think he gets the balance of the sarcasm with the seriousness, with the brute force. I think all of that's done really well. It's a bummer to me that he won't get to do this more because I think he very much could have grown into an iconic performance. I think he had it in him. I think you see the seeds of that here, and it's unfortunate that this went the way it did.
Ian McShane plays Professor Broom, his adopted father, the reason Hellboy is in the BPRD at all. And I love this casting. I mean, I'll just say it up front. Casting is not the issue with this movie if it does have issues.
Not at all.
It's great cast, and this is fantastic. I know Ian McShane from the John Wick movies where he plays Winston, sort of the head of the assassin organization. I love him in those movies. I love him here. I just thought it made a lot of sense. He's that tough love type father to Hellboy, but he cares deep down, and he shows it. He makes it at the opportune times. It makes a point to show that he genuinely cares about him. He's great. I loved it.
No, like you said, he's a fantastic actor, and he's been acting since the 70s. He's actually in a movie, one of my favorite murder mysteries called The Last of Sheila. That's 1973. So that's, almost 50 years ago now. So obviously that's a huge career. But yeah, they definitely play that relationship a little bit differently here. Obviously in the first one with John Hurt. And John Hurt, to his credit, looks like his father right off the page. Like, yeah. I don't know if that was the intention, but when they cast John Hurt, they very much made that effort to just put that straight appearance and bring it through. So they definitely go a different direction here. He's not made up any differently. He still looks very much just like Ian McShane. But they play that relationship a lot more, I don't know if tough love's the word, but he seems a lot more hard on him. There's some moments of kind of when it's just them where there's a little bit, like there's a scene where he helps him with the horns and everything. But overall, he's played a lot more gruffer, I guess. Like he's a lot more hard on him.
Like when Hellboy gets down in his feels about his true place in the world, he's like, get over it. You got a job to do. Let's go.
Right. Like he's got no time really to like bother with it. But then at the end of the film, he kind of has this moment where he, like I said, shows that underneath all of it, he had no regrets and he just tried to be the best that he could. So you're playing it differently, but I think it works. Like I said, Ian McShane is a great casting. It wouldn't matter how you chose to play him. I have no doubt Ian McShane could have done it. But again, a fantastic choice. That was another one where they announced it. I was like, great, in, boom, no issues.
Sasha Lane plays Alice Monaghan. Now, I looked through her filmography, a few credits here and there, nothing I really recognized before this movie. However, since this movie, she has come back to the comic book world in Loki, where she plays one of the hunters for that, what's that organization called?
The TVA.
The TVA, yes. So she's in that. Look for her there, but I think she does a good job here. She is wow, how do you describe her powers? A medium? She's a medium? Is that what you would say?
Yes, she's that's exactly what Ian McShane calls her. She's one of the most powerful psychic mediums they have.
She kind of takes everything in stride. She's kind of brings a lot of levity to the movie, a lot of lightheartedness. Right. Whenever, Hellboy can get kind of emotional, and we'll get to Daniel Dae Kim in a minute, but he's very much military and serious, and she's kind of always taking it in stride.
The character in the comics ends up becoming Hellboy's companion at a certain point, especially towards the end of his time on the terrestrial plane, because he does have extended stories outside of the terrestrial plane. But she ends up becoming one of his kind of cohorts, especially when we get into like the Excalibur stuff within the comics. But in this, she's given a backstory. This is mostly from the page, but there's a link between her and Hellboy going back to when she's like a child. And that's one of the things I actually do kind of like this movie does. We'll talk about a little more later. Is like, we're very much in the middle of this world. We're basically lots of other things have happened, and we're just kind of given that information as we need it. We don't bog it down with like they didn't put the scene of them working their origin together at the beginning of the film. That way they could come back to it later. They were just like, hey, this happened. But she's great in this, but she's on Hellboy's side. I like that. She ends up playing a big part in the climax of the film as well. But yeah, I thought this was great casting too, where she got to kind of had a good rapport with everybody, and yeah, great choice.
Mila Jovovich plays our villain, Vivian Nimue. And what does that say about Mila Jovovich? I mean, she's been around forever. Everyone knows who she is. I think The Fifth Element is probably the first time people took notice of her in her career, I would say. Right. I of course watched The Fifth Element growing up. Also, a movie she did called The Messenger, Joan of Arc, which I don't think it's a great movie by any means, but I saw it a ton as a kid. I don't know why. I think it was always on cable or whatever, but
you talk about weird follow-ups. Luke Besson following up The Fifth Element with the Joan of Arc movie is a little weird.
It definitely is, but I think she's great in it. I don't remember the movie well enough to give you too much of a review on it, but I know her performance was very good as Joan of Arc. And then she made Resident Evil, and she's made 20 of those since then. That's kind of dominated her career, but I still love any time that she shows up. I think she's doing a good job here. I mean, there's not a lot of shades to the character.
Right.
She's like an ultimate evil. Her role is to tempt Hellboy to the side of the, quote, monsters versus the side of the humans, because his true nature, of course, is a monster. So a little bit of the seductress, but she is
so
not...
he thinks.
Oh. She is not... not a lot of sex
There's no
appeal.
shades here. There's no shades, yeah.
She's not using like her sexuality. She is a witch, and she's kind of gross, and she has some very gross scenes where her body has to be like reassembled. It's very much, like I said, not a lot of shades, just evil queen witch. That's who she is, and she plays the role well.
She's the Blood Queen.
Andrew, Daniel Dae Kim is in this movie. Speaking of beautiful people, the most beautiful man in the world.
Oh my god.
Oh
my god.
He plays Ben Daimo, and he is great. I don't know. He's shirtless in a few scenes. Good looking dude. Before we jump too much into that, I do want to point out that this role was originally supposed to be played by Ed Skrein, who is a white man. White Englishman.
Well, you may know Ed Skrein from Ajax in the first Deadpool film. That's the big thing he did before this. So, as you can see, if you've seen Deadpool, he is not Asian.
Ben Daimo in the comics is, I believe, Japanese American, but he's of Asian descent.
Yes.
And the internet, as much as they were receptive of David Harbour and some of the other castings, were quick to point out that there seemed to be a bit of whitewashing going on with this character. And Ed Skrein himself made the decision to step down from the role, which I think he handled it so well. I want to read his official statement here. He said, "Last week it was announced that I would be playing Major Ben Daimo in the upcoming Hellboy reboot. I accepted the role unaware that the character in the original comics was of mixed Asian heritage. There has been intense conversation and understandable upset since that announcement, and I must do what I feel is right. It is clear that representing the character in a culturally accurate way holds significance for people, and that to neglect this responsibility would continue a worrying tendency to obscure ethnic minority stories and voices in the arts. I feel it is important to honor and respect that. Therefore, I have decided to step down so the role can be cast appropriately. Representation of ethnic diversity is important, especially to me as I have a mixed heritage family. It is our responsibility to make moral decisions in difficult times and to give voice to inclusivity. It is my hope that one day these discussions will become less necessary and that we can help make equal representation in the arts a reality. I am sad to leave Hellboy, but if this decision brings us closer to that day, it is worth it. I hope it makes a difference. With love and hope, Ed Skrein." Super classy, very smart, and I very well written. I totally believe that when he, the role of Ben Daimo in the mainstream world,
no one knows who that is.
People don't know who that is. And I totally believe that he just took this role not knowing the history until it was pointed out to him. And I think he made the absolute right decision when that came up. Compared to some other actors who were in a similar situation, and when it was brought up, they sort of didn't handle it too well, or doubled down, or tried to make excuses. I won't name any people I'm thinking of specifically, but I was very refreshing to see that response.
Yes.
And it led to the casting of Daniel Dae Kim, which is perfect casting for this role.
No, I agree. Daniel Dae Kim, obviously, not Japanese, but South Korean. But definitely staying with the character's Asian heritage. And again, Daniel Dae Kim is the most attractive man on the planet.
He's
great.
He's
53.
Unreal, really?
I can only hope. He looks better than I do now.
Well,
I mean, it's just not fair. It's just not fair at all.
Technically a Best of the Rest alumni. We talked about him way back in Hulk, where he was on screen for like 10 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
That wraps up most of the main cast. There's a lot of other things we could get into, some voices of animated characters and things like that, but there's only one other person I want to point out.
Yes.
Thomas Haden Church plays Lobster Johnson. Now, Andrew, this is my first time watching the movie. This was maybe like 30 minutes into the movie, I think. Lobster Johnson shows up in a flashback scene to whenever Hellboy is first discovered, when he's a baby. We're in Nazi Germany, and Lobster Johnson comes on like a friggin' hero that he is, just wasting Nazis left and right and quipping. And I'm like, wow, there's my Mark Strong award. Thomas Haden Church is about to join Chris Evans and Sam Elliott as a 2-time Mark Strong Award winner. This is fantastic. And then that scene ends.
And he's gone.
And we don't see the man again until like literally the last scene of the movie. We'll get to that a little bit later. But
yeah,
you cast Thomas Haden Church. You assume it's going to be a significant role. I'll let you talk about the significance of Lobster Johnson himself, but man, I was left wanting so much more of this performance.
Well, yeah, and I agree. And it's an interesting choice to involve him at all, really, because the role ends up being so inconsequential. Like, if you had taken him out of this movie, the plot would not have changed.
At all.
No. You could have very much done the raid, because there is that scene. It's a flashback scene to Hellboy's creation. And it's essentially a recreation of a scene that's in the first Hellboy movie where Lobster Johnson is not used. And it works just as fine there. But they put Lobster Johnson there. They get a fairly high-profile name to play him. And then that's kind of it. We get a stinger with him in the mid-credits stinger also features him. And you got I don't know if the intention was to do something else with him or not. But it's interesting. But yeah, the character is a Nazi fighter from the late 30s, early 40s. That's his role in the Hellboy comics, but he does continue. Death is not the end for Lobster Johnson. This movie definitely implies that, but in the comics, that is also completely accurate, where he continues to live on after dying, aiding BPRD and a whole bunch of other people. But yeah, an interesting choice to put such a high-profile actor in such a limited role.
Yeah, the Sandman himself from Spider-Man 3, like I said, a former Mark Strong Award winner. God, it's so good. I mean, he's just like a classic pulp character with his one-liners and his very simple,
real Phantom type
costume.
Performance.
Yes, very much so. That's exactly what I was reminded of. Yeah. God, I loved it.
But
so
with
much.
a way cooler costume.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah.
They straight up grabbed that costume off the page, and it might look a little ridiculous, but I was like, that's awesome.
All right, Andrew, let's jump into this movie. Let's talk about some of the best scenes in the movie, some of our favorite scenes. And again, we're starting at the top, at the high point, at when this movie is firing on all cylinders. Andrew, what would you say is the best scene of the movie?
This is gonna sound reductionist, but my favorite scene in this movie, and I remember this from the first time I saw it, is the first Hellboy scene in Mexico. Just because
yeah, it's pretty good.
It's so wild and ridiculous. So I'm gonna go ahead and go with this. There's some other scenes I like a lot, but this one was like, because going into seeing this movie, the reviews had already hit. So like going in to watch it, I already saw that like it was being critically shredded, and I was kind of like, all right, whatever. I gotta go watch it, and we'll see. And this was like very much when I was going in, I wanted it to be a BVS situation too, where I was gonna go in and be like, critics don't know what they're talking about. This is awesome. And so we get that exposition about Nimue and King Arthur and how she comes to get split up. But then it cuts, and Hellboy is in Tijuana.
Yes,
and he's looking
big
for
letters
this
across the screen. Tijuana.
That happens a lot in this movie. It just cutscene, big block letters.
And it's not consistent with what it's representing. So we got Tijuana, which is a city. Then it says Colorado, which is a state. Then it says BPRD, which is a building. And then it says England, which is a country
again. There's no consistency whatsoever. But either way, so this scene is Hellboy is going after Agent Ruiz, who went to Mexico 3 weeks ago to investigate a nest of vampires and has not been heard from since. So Hellboy goes down there and is looking for him, and he's talking to his dad, and his dad's like, simple extraction, don't make it a big deal, blah, blah, blah. And he ends up going into this lucha libre show where he finds Ruiz is wrestling as, I can't remember what the guy calls himself, but it's the same name that in the Hellboy in Mexico comic that this evil luchador he fights has. So he tries to get him, like, talk him out of it, and he's trying to, like, be like, hey, come on, let's go. No, don't need to keep wrestling now. Let's get out of here. And then he ends up picking a fight. And during this fight, this Spanish version of Rock You Like a Hurricane by the Scorpions starts playing.
It's so
and
awesome.
They're literally like fighting in the wrestling ring. And he starts like morphing into this vampire while they're doing that. And in the first time I was watching this, I was like, hell yeah. What's everybody's problem? I was like, this is the greatest movie of all time. And like, And it's just this wild and ridiculous thing that just felt like so Hellboy to me, because I'm like, this is something that would never happen in another movie, but it very much is taking all these pieces of this story called Hellboy in Mexico, kind of mixing them together to get this kind of short little intro piece out of it. But I just thought it was, and obviously it ends and we get to the rest of the movie, but it ends up not really playing a bigger part whatsoever, but it's really just like meant to intro Hellboy to this new audience. And I'm like, in that regard, I was like, this is awesome. I was like, this is great.
I mean, I agree, because I was thinking the same thing. It's my first time watching it, and I'm like, all right, this is the first big scene. What's this all about? Hellboy fighting a luchador in a big ring down in Mexico. Like, this is awesome. And
this is great.
There's a lot. This movie plays a little fast and loose. You know, the BPRD, they're supposed to be like a secret organization. You know, the public doesn't know about them. They play it pretty fast and loose, though, because there's a lot of fights that are like in daylight and in public, and there's clearly people around. And like Hellboy is walking through Tijuana with just a trench coat on. It's very much like the original TMNT with Raphael walking around with just a trench coat and a hat. And it's like, is that really enough to disguise him? But it is, I guess, because what I find interesting is he starts this fight in the wrestling ring, and it's a luchador versus friggin' Hellboy, and the audience is chanting and cheering. But as soon as he takes the mask off the luchador and he has bat ears, the crowd freaks out. They're like, oh wait, that is too far.
We've crossed the line.
But they continue their fight. I love how it ends. He throws him onto the ring post, which acts as like a stake that drives through his body. Is a pretty gnarly way to end the fight.
I was like, this is awesome. I was like, this is fantastic. I was way into that first scene.
The intro of Hellboy, you hear his voice first as he's driving a car. You just hear like him on the phone, and then the phone is on speakerphone and it's sitting like in the passenger seat. And then to end the call, he hangs it up with his right hand, which is a giant stone hand. Yep. And he goes to hang it up, and it just like shatters the phone. He's like, oh damn it. And then I love the joke at the end of the scene because, you know, Esteban was his friend, and he was sad that he had to kill him. So he's like drinking a sour away at the bar, and he's got his head down. And the BPRD, some folks come to bring him back. They go, Hellboy. And he goes, no, it's Josh. People confuse us all the time. So yeah, I'm watching this. I'm like, man, I'm on board. Like this is a wacky tone. It works. And I agree. It's a great intro to the character, to this new tone, this new Hellboy. Awesome scene. I agree 100%.
Yep.
Now, it's not what I put down as my favorite scene in the movie, but it's not because I didn't not like the scene or anything. It's just there's some pretty good scenes in this movie, especially the action scenes. So the one I'm going to highlight is his fight against the giants. He has to take down 3 literal giants, like big old trolls that are 50 foot tall, like out in the field. And this fight is so wacky and so fun. And it kind of must sound a bit of a hypocritical, because there's been a few episodes of our podcast where I talk about scenes that involve a lot of CG, and that I don't like whenever the camera gets to do unrealistic camera moves because it takes you out of it. This scene breaks a few rules. The camera, because it is in a largely CG space, it will move in shots that you couldn't get with a crane or even a drone. It moves around unrealistically, but I think it does it with a purpose. It's not doing it throughout the entire movie. It's mostly during here. And the reason is Hellboy is, 8 foot tall, I would guess. These monsters are like 50 foot tall. And the camera will change to being like down by Hellboy over his shoulder. And you get this scope and the sense of scale. This little guy, relatively speaking, taking on these giant monsters. And then the camera will move during the fight and it'll be up by the giants. And now you've got these giant and a tiny little Hellboy. So it kind of reverses those perspectives to great action. It enhances the fight. I mean, this might sound dramatic. I don't know if I've ever seen a fight like this before. So this scale, this little person, again, relatively, taking down these giants, and he's using like entire trees that he's uprooting out of the ground. He steals one of their swords and slashes their arm off. I mentioned this movie like really digs into the R rating, and this is no exception. He sends a tree through one of the giants' jaws, like up through their head, and they slowly like fall down onto Hellboy, and like guts and stuff fall onto him. It gets pretty gross. But it's just a blast. It's a fun a fun scene. I love that it takes place during the daytime because speaking of like heavy CG scenes, a lot of times you'll set the scenes at night and stuff because it makes it easier to hide some of the CG. And there's a few shots that are a little wonky in this fight. I'm not gonna lie, but I appreciate that it's like broad daylight, middle of a field, gnarly scene, heavy metal music in the score. I was having a good time with that fight scene.
Yeah, that fight scene's really like it is a blast because it's something that we'd not seen really to that point. In the first Hellboy movie, obviously he does have a little bit of a fight with the weird not Cthulhu monster that Rasputin is summoning, but there's nothing like this. And obviously the second film, mostly all about the Golden Army. So with this one, it really was, they did take an opportunity to be like, you know what, let's get some weird stuff in here and have them fight some stuff we've not seen before. So in that regard, I was really glad they did dive into some of this stuff. I think it's really cool. Now,
you said the scene in Mexico was our introduction to Hellboy, but technically not the first scene of the movie, which takes place in the, I guess you would call it's the Dark Ages. I guess I should know that because
517 AD.
The first line of the movie, the narrator tells us it's known as the Dark Ages, and for good reason. And that just tells you what you're in for. It tells you a lot about the tone, about the rating, about what they're setting. And they introduce King Arthur, and then again the narrator says, "Yes, that King Arthur." which Andrew, make this short because we're going to dive into this later. But is the legend of King Arthur traditionally tied into the story of Hellboy?
Yes.
Okay, that was news to me. That was a surprise. I'm like, all right, this is a weird place to start, but King Arthur and Excalibur are a big part of this movie. And I guess the Knights of King Arthur are the first ones to kill the Blood Queen. They cut her body up in different pieces and spread it across the land so she cannot bring upon, death to the world like she likes to do.
That's what she does.
But the main plot of this movie kicks off whenever Hellboy is sent to go meet up with the Osiris Club, who is, I don't know, are they sort of like friends of the BPRD over in England?
That's the implication you're given. That's the implication you're given, is that they are an adjacent kind of organization in the UK, because as we know, BPRD is in Colorado, big block letters. Well, the Osiris Club is in England, big block letters. But no. Doesn't say where in England, just England.
England.
But we're kind of given the implication they're in a side organization. The thing they are notably known for dealing with is apparently these giants. They apparently have something they call the Wild Hunt, where they deal with these giants before they get to populated areas. And Hellboy is brought in to assist with this.
There's 3 giants, and they tell him that, they can take down 1 or maybe 2, but since there's 3, they need Hellboy's help.
Yes.
I love the bit about, they call it the Osiris Club. And when he first learns that, Hellboy's like, "You mean the strip club in Jersey?" And his dad's like, no. But whenever he goes to the UK and he meets with them, he asks him, "You guys ever been to the Osiris Club in Jersey? It's like this, but with strippers."
It looks just like this, but with strippers. Yeah. And it's like this old English mansion. Like, I was like, this is fantastic. Hellboy really does get some like the quips work, the sarcasm works.
Very good.
He does a great job with it. So he's introduced to the members of the Osiris Club. They are properly, they have the appearance of like upper class British people. This almost feels more like almost a game to them, far less of like a genuine serious threat.
They've got the heads of the previous giants they've killed like on the wall as trophies.
It just feels, what's the guy's name? I think Lord Adam Glarin is the lead guy there. And that just sounds, if you told me that dude was the leader of something called the Osiris Club, I'd believe you. But yes, all is not as it seems with the Osiris Club, for as they are about to embark on their hunt and stage their ambush, as it were, we find out that the giants aren't what they're intending to hunt this time. They're hunting Hellboy.
Yeah, they're out on the ride, and they just shove a sword straight through Hellboy's chest, like into his back, and it comes out of his chest. Like, it's pretty gnarly.
It's brutal, yeah.
And, Hellboy starts to fight for his life, but he is outnumbered by the Osiris Club, and just before he succumbs to his injuries, a giant comes in and takes out the Osiris Club. And when Hellboy does recover, now it's him versus the giants. And we go into that scene that I talked about already. But, one thing I want to point out is he gets that sword through his chest. And for the rest of the movie, he has the hole in his jacket from where the sword went in. And so that made me start to pay attention. And like his battle damage is consistent throughout the movie. As it gets cut up in different scenes, it stays that way for the rest of the movie, which must have been a nightmare for continuity and for costuming, because you don't typically shoot movies in chronological order. For them to pay that much attention to detail, I thought was just a super, super cool and nice little touch. I really like that.
No, yeah, I thought that was really cool. And just a nice way to do that. But whoever that continuity supervisor was their life must have been a nightmare.
Micro Mark Strong Award to the costume
to
design.
whoever did that. Or whoever was keeping track of what his costume needed to be on what day. Because dear God.
It reminded me of the first time I played Arkham Asylum, the Batman game. Like, it does the same thing. Like, as you get into fights with different supervillains and your cape and costume get torn up, it stays that way the rest of the game. Yeah. I'm like, wow, cool. This is amazing. So I just saw this on my notes, and I'm laughing now like I did in the movie. There's a follow-up to that first scene where he hangs up the phone and he breaks it with his stone hand. There's a follow-up. This might be the funniest part of the movie. It's a follow-up where he hangs up the phone with his regular hand. And he's pushing the button and it's not hanging up. And like the third time he taps his phone with his regular hand, the screen cracks. And he goes, "Oh, come on."
Good stuff. Good stuff.
That was so funny. That was very good.
It's you mentioned it before, but the fight scenes in this movie are all pretty cool. The big final fight, I might be jumping ahead, but the final fight where it's kind of like full form Nimue and her giant, God, what is that guy's name?
The pig man.
His name is like, what is his name?
It's definitely not Bebop, which is
it's like Grugok, I think, or Graugok or something. I can't even pronounce it. I've only ever read it for years. And I just watched the movie.
My Bebop reference, Andrew? Come on.
Sick reference, Chris. Your references are out of control. Everybody knows that.
Thank you.
But he kind of gets amped up, and he's fighting Hellboy, and then we kind of get so Daimo at this point, he's got these scars on his face, which look pretty gnarly. But,
I mean, still a handsome man with those scars.
Yeah,
maybe more so.
With the scars, still more handsome than either of us. But you kind of get this implication throughout the movie that there might be something a little bit more to him. Like he takes some medication at one point, and ultimately he's like a were-jaguar. Like so he, and it's an odd choice, but that's kind of carrying over. So in that final fight, Hellboy's kind of getting stomped. And then Daimo transforms, and the Hellboy and Daimo versus Graubach or whatever his name is. That fight is pretty gnarly. That was a pretty good one, where they switch it to the handicap match, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, at one point I'm just gonna call him Bebop because his real name's too hard to keep up with. He like throws Hellboy up into the air and then gores him with his tusk. And it goes through Hellboy, and he's like holding him up in the air by his tusk. And there's some parts in this movie, I mean, hashtag positivity podcast, but there's some parts where, it's an R rating and it gets a little gratuitous for my taste.
It goes I can agree
pretty far. But there's other scenes like this one here where goring Hellboy, where it's in a fun action scene where they do some stuff that you couldn't do in a PG-13 movie, but I think it works, and it's
right.
It takes advantage of the rating in a good way.
No, yeah, I think kind of what you're talking about is there's a scene right after like Hellboy grabs Excalibur, and we're basically given a glimpse of what hell on earth is, and there is just a lot of like gratuitous shots there.
I'm glad you bring that up because yes, there's gratuitous. The one where it really goes too far for me is I don't even want to say it. There's a chamber of. You're
talking about Baba Yaga.
Yes, he goes to meet the Baba Yaga in this alternate dimension, and there is a chamber of dead bodies, of small dead bodies, hanging from chains that the Baba Yaga uses in her food. And I'm like, I don't need to see this. Like, I get it. I get the idea.
It serves no greater purpose. Like, it's Baba Yaga. We know what the deal is.
But the apocalyptic scene that you're talking about,
Mhm.
because the Del Toro movies, they are always hinting at, you know, his true purpose is to bring about the apocalypse. It's going to happen one day. And there's some visions of it. You see him with his horns outgrown. You see like an apocalyptic wasteland after it's happened. They hint at it. This movie clearly wanted to lean into it harder and give us a real glimpse of what that would look like. So yeah, he grabs the sword, and then there's a vision of him with his horns and with his fire crown that looks super rad. I really love this look. And this sword is on fire. He's riding like a friggin' dragon and just slaughtering humans. I mean, he's just like slashing them with a sword. They're being cut in half. It's pretty gnarly. And on one hand, I think that was the point. I mean, I think they
sure.
want to like show us like, you know, he's a good guy, but he's capable of some sick stuff if he were to allow himself to succumb to that. So yeah, it leans into it a lot there. And then we're jumping around a bit, but that's what we do on the show.
Right.
There's the scene where he does succumb.
That's the one I'm talking about. That's the one I'm talking about.
Oh, not the vision where he actually
the vision was kind of like very much a vision, and like the people were kind of faceless. Like,
yes,
you see it all, but like
okay.
the scene I'm kind of talking about is he draws the sword for real, because it turns out
it actually happens. Yeah,
the sword is under the church they're all fighting in. Very convenient, but it does make sense. That's where Arthur's tomb would be, probably. Maybe, I don't know geography, but in
England, you mean?
Yeah,
in England,
block letters. But in this moment, like, the ground is literally splitting open, and these giant, monstrous Doom video game type monsters are all emerging, and they're slaughtering these people.
They literally rip the skin off of people.
They rip the skin off of people.
And they show it all, like in great
rip
detail.
them in half, like horizontally. They rip them in half vertically. Like, they spare nothing. It is.
There's one
brutal.
walking through the streets that has like spike legs, and it's like a skewered. There's like bodies skewered on their legs. Yeah, like it gets
pretty gnarly.
That was definitely one of the scenes. I was like, okay, this is a lot. This is a lot.
I had forgotten about it too. Like, I was like, started happening, and I was like, oh, heavens!
It just keeps going. Clutching her pearls.
Clutch the pearls. But yeah, it was. But I mean, I get it. Like, in a way, like, you know, you're going for that different look, and like in that instance, you're really trying to emphasize that this is a very bad thing. This is an awful situation and an awful thing to be happening, and this is what's going to happen. So,
one of the first scenes to really make me go like, oh, this is rated R, which, by the way, like I said, I didn't know this was rated R when I started it. And I've been watching a lot of these movies with my daughter, who is about to turn 11. And we've been watching a lot of PG-13 movies, which is fine for the most part. Nothing there too bad or too scary. And I'm glad I didn't try to watch this with her, because I don't know what scene would have done it. But one of these scenes, she would have been like, I'm out of here. What the hell are you making me watch? One of the first ones like that for me was the Bebop. He's going to get all the Blood Queen's body parts together.
Yes.
And one of them is being held like by these monks, basically. They have like a vow of silence.
Oh,
and he breaks into their church, and he's killing them, and it's pretty standard stuff. But he corners one guy, and he's trying to get him to open the chest, and the guy won't do it. And he's like, fine, I'll do it myself. And he reaches into his mouth and rips off his lower jaw. And again, it doesn't cut away. It's not implied. Like, we just see all this happen. And like, I'm like, I don't know why this is happening. And then he eats the man's tongue. And then he can talk in his voice. And he says the right phrase to open the chest. And you know what? That's kind of cool.
Yeah. I don't think that's how science works, but we're not dealing with science here, are we?
No. Although, to be fair, Andrew, have you ever eaten someone's tongue? Maybe it does work that way.
It very much earns the R rating. It's wild.
I love they flash back to 1992. Again, we're told in big block letters it's 1992. And it's showing how Hellboy met Alice. And she's a baby. Yes. She's been stolen by these imps, these fairies. Fairies, yeah, of course. And I just love Hellboy's look here. He's got like a beanie on. He's got like a 5 o'clock shadow. He's a little bit grungy because it's the 90s. I just thought it was really fun. They gave him like a unique look for this time period.
Yes. This is actually how Bebop and Hellboy's rivalry begins. This is where it all starts. Basically, Bebop kidnapped Alice to give her to fairies, and they were supposed to, and then he was going to basically live as Alice, essentially. Like because that's the thing, is he shows up and they're like, it looks like Alice, but it's not Alice, and he realizes that it's a changeling that's been made to look like her, and Hellboy susses it out and ends up basically telling this thing, bring Alice back or you're going to have trouble. And he waits around, apparently reading a copy of Alice in Wonderland while waiting, and then eventually they bring the child back. But basically,
God, I didn't even get that until you said it just now. I was like, because it makes it a point to show what he's reading.
Yeah,
her name is Alice. That is a four horsemen in the church.
Yes,
level.
But either way, apparently after interacting with those fairies, that's how Alice gets her powers. Essentially, she basically, after being exposed to the fairies and their magics, it carried over. And then she eventually finds out that she's got a pretty additional wicked superpower where she can, like, punch people's spirits out of their bodies.
Yeah, that was so cool.
Like, they're in this final, basically, it's the scene where Nimue is about to extract her blood from this tree, which is, like, the last piece to kind of fully restore her. Because, that's how it works. And while they're all trying to get up there, this undead army is kind of rising up. Again, like, Blood Queen getting her blood out of a tree while this undead army of zombies comes and fights Hellboy and stuff. This is all, like, on paper, just sounds rad as hell. But so Hellboy, like, runs off to, like, try to stop Nimue while Daimo and Alice are left behind. And Daimo's, like, got his gun and doing his thing and trying to do the best he can. But at this point, he's not transforming. He's trying to not do that. And so they kind of think everything's happening. And then Alice just, like, offhandedly punches one of these things, and its spirit just leaves its body, and the body disintegrates. And I was like, "That's awesome!" Like,
it's so cool. And she punches it, and you see, like, the ghost, the spirit, like continue on past the body. Yeah, it's a very cool effect.
It's pretty awesome. And I
that fight in the woods is pretty great, because, like, there's zombies literally rising up from the ground, and at one point, like, a zombie's head emerges, and Hellboy just runs up and punts the head off the body, and the head just goes flying through the air. I think he says, "Go!"
Yeah, he does. So it's fun stuff. Like, again, the banter, the kind of the wit with Hellboy is all there. It's pretty cool. And there's a lot of really cool. Basically, every fight scene in this movie delivers on some level. There's fun to be had with all of them. They're all brutal. They're all fun. Not all fun, but, like, they're either really brutal and, like, kind of cool to watch, or there's, like, fun banter back and forth.
Yeah.
They do make the most out of all of those.
And at the end of that scene, we have our first confrontation between Hellboy and Nimue. And I love it, because how many times have we seen in a movie where a villain is talking about their master plan and waxing poetic, and our hero is just standing there and listening, and you're like, do something, like, you have a chance. So this time, Nimue is talking to some of her sisters. She's talking to some other evil beings.
Which is,
And then just out of nowhere, half of her head explodes, and you see Hellboy standing there with a smoking gun. So, like, he didn't walk up and, like, listen and announce his presence. He's just sees the bad guy, boom, blows her head off, and her eyeballs, like, dangling.
Her eyeballs, like, dangling and stuff, and, like, all of her minions kind of run away, and it's back to just them. But
and he gets this quip. He's like, "Oh, sorry, did I interrupt?" But he just started off with a bang, pun intended. But I was like,
boom!
It was very refreshing to just, like, there's the bad guy, just killed him, just in this.
Right. Don't mess around. But it was that whole sequence in the woods leading up there at what is it, Pendle Hill, block letters. And that's where originally, when King Arthur and Merlin and his group stopped her and split her into pieces, that was the same spot. So her blood went into the tree, and then her body was scattered. But that was a cool sequence. And then, like I said, that ends with basically Nimue in full form, starting to unleash the apocalypse, as it were.
And that's when she starts to sort of try to influence Hellboy, saying, like, we are monsters. Like, why defend them? They hate us. They want to kill us. We belong together. It's our destiny. And I love his response. He says, because she says, we belong together. He says, we do, but this is not going to work, because I'm a Capricorn and you're nuts.
Yeah.
God, David Harbour is so good in this movie.
He is really good in this. If you're going to watch the movie for any reason, watching it for Harbour alone works.
Yeah.
I do kind of like the scene where he shows up to the final fight and he, like, gets out of the car, and like somebody accidentally like shoots the window of the door of the car he just got out of, and he just turns around and he's like, "Hey,
I'm on your side.
I'm on your side." And the guy's like, "Sorry."
Yeah, that's good.
Some fun. Yeah, hey, Harbour is, you're right. He's just so, yeah, it's kind of a bummer that he won't get to keep doing this, because he really is good in this.
I really appreciate, as someone who I've been known to make a pun or two in the day, or a dad joke, if you will. Sometimes
in this economy,
listen closely to this podcast. You might catch one every now and then. But I really love, and he kills Nimue. He cuts her head off with his sword, and then he throws her head down into hell. And he says a pun, but he says it so defeated because it's like almost too easy. He goes, "Lady, quit while you're ahead," and throws it down. It's like he's not even like proud of it, because it's just such a layup.
Like, it's like that moment where you're like, I can't not say this in this moment, so let's get it over with. But yes. That whole final fight is all pretty brutal, and like it's a big moment of like Hellboy kind of being forced to reckon with his quote unquote destiny, and he chooses the path of good, such as it is.
I have this note written down. I don't know if you have the same thoughts here. Daniel Dae Kim, whenever he turns into a jaguar, if they were to make like a gritty live action Thundercats reboot, I think it would look like this jaguar.
Probably, yeah. I doubt it would look as beautiful as Daniel Dae Kim does normally, but yes.
I mean, what could?
What does?
The last scene of the movie is another big tease. It's a pretty fun action scene. It jumps to 6 months later. Again, big block letters. Now it's not telling us location, but a time jump. And we've got our full team here. We've got Alice, we've got Hellboy, and we've got Daimo. Alice
with her new like iron knuckle thing.
Yeah,
on her hand.
It's pretty cool. And they're at the Atlantis Club?
No, it's the Oannes Society. It's another.
Oanna?
It's Oannes.
Okay, the Oanna Society. Excuse me. And they're like, they make the Osiris look like Cub Scouts or whatever. And she's like, so many boy clubs. Okay,
so many all boys clubs.
So they bust into this like factory, and they're just like murdering people left and right.
Cool
it's a very fun way to end the movie. A fun, high action, high octane scene, and they wipe everybody out, and then Alice says, "Well, what is this over here?" And she kind of like dusts off the nameplate, and she's like, "Sapien, what does that mean?" And then a hand inside of this tank of water goes up against the glass. Cut to credits.
That guy from Shape of Water is going to be in the BPRD. Sweet.
Yeah, that's clearly what they are teasing.
Clearly, yes.
It's the
first
Toro IP.
The first of several teases, because that's the last scene of the movie. But this credits is littered with a couple more scenes, all teasing some more stuff.
Well, okay, let's go one at a time. So first, we have a Sapien scene. Okay,
right.
And
we got Abe Sapien.
Yeah, the hand didn't look exactly like the Del Toro Sapien, but you know who it is. Obviously, you know who it is. I think it's very interesting that they're teasing a Sapien scene, because if it weren't for those Del Toro movies, no one would know who Abe Sapien is. Of course, people that read the comics, but mainstream people wouldn't even know who Abe Sapien is. So it's funny to do like a reboot and then tease a character that you saw in the previous iteration of this series. I thought that was a pretty interesting way to go out.
It is, and it's actually kind of, like you said, it's odd, because it really is something that you're only going to have knowledge of because of the other movies.
Right.
So it is just that. It's literally just a tease. You are giving nothing more after that. And yeah, we clearly know what that's setting up. I can appreciate in a way that they went with a different group in this movie. That feels definitely kind of like one of those things, though, where like we're switching it up just for the sake of switching it up. Because obviously we don't go with Liz, Selma Blair from the others with her fire powers. We go with Alice instead, who is from the comics and ends up having, sticks by Hellboy a lot. So it's not like it's out of nowhere. And then obviously we go with Daimo instead of Ape. And I don't have a problem with either choice, but I think both casting and both characters are good. I think they made for a really good dynamic. But obviously with the end of this film, they were definitely teasing setting up the larger group. Obviously didn't really come to pass, but
that would have been a cool place to go, with having a team of 4, 5, 6 characters.
I mean, the BPRD is supposed to be a large organization. There's points in the comics where groups split. Hellboy splits from the BPRD at a certain point, and you get BPRD comics that are basically just Abe and his amazing friends, and they're still great. But
God,
yeah,
that would be a great title for a movie, Abe and his amazing friends. I would watch that. So we got another scene. Yes. I guess you could call it a tease, and it's Hellboy at his father's grave, and he is drowning his sorrow away. He's got a bottle of tequila. He's kicking back. He's obviously drunk off of his ass. And then Lobster Johnson shows up and gives him a bit of a pep talk. And Hellboy is like a fanboying out. He's like, "Oh my god, you probably hear this all the time, but I'm such a big fan." And then Lobster Johnson walks through him because he's a ghost now. And then Hellboy just turns and goes, "I love you, Lobster Johnson." And that's the last line.
That's Hellboy's last line in this movie.
Yeah, it was very funny.
It's pretty wild. But again,
I love the scene because it gave us more Lobster Johnson.
Yeah, by all means. I love it because it's not just that but he accepts that he's a fan and knows exactly what he's gonna add. He's like, "You want to see the claw, right?" Yep. Yeah. Holds up his hand and he's like, "That's so awesome." It's so weird because even in death, Lobster Johnson knows what people want to see about him. He knows his celebrity status. It's very funny. And again, Haden Church is just great. He's got a good stature. The voice is great. It's definitely one that you would expect. I could imagine him the stuff he says in the movie is all lines from the Lobster Johnson comics. They're all the things that he says. So they're pulling that straight off the page, and he doesn't sound ridiculous saying them. He sounds pretty accurate.
He's got a great voice.
He does.
Yeah.
If Daniel Dae Kim is the perfect man, Thomas Haden Church is the perfect voice.
Put those together, and you got something weird.
You got a stew going, baby. But yeah, so this is a cool scene. It's really just Lobster pulling Hellboy out of the swamp, as I've heard it called. He's down in the dumps. His dad has passed. He's kind of wondering where his place is in the world. It's a little odd that this comes after the Abe scene, but where he just was kind of fine in an action sequence. But
sure.
But yeah, so it's cool, and it's really just Lobster Johnson telling him that, hey, the worst is still coming, man. So you better get ready. And Lobster has helped the PPRD as a ghost before, so they may have very well been setting up that Lobster was going to play a part in the future. So we do get a final scene in this, which is yet again another tease. This movie was very confident in its ability that they were going to be making more of them. Some of them really do function as their own. The Abe one really who Abe is. It's a tease. That's all it is. That's if they do more with it, great. If not, whatever. And then the Lobster one is very similar, where it's more of just a pep talk. So if it didn't build to anything more, that's fine. But it's definitely hinting at this greater evil. So the end of this movie, the very, very end. This is at the end of the credits. This, like I said, this had more sequences than most Marvel movie does at the end of it. But
yeah.
So we cut back to Baba Yaga's house, which they do upright. It's in its own dimension. It's got the chicken legs with the house. They're doing that whole thing. And Baba Yaga is nasty looking in this movie. She is gross. In every sense of the term. As Hellboy says, how do you have hair on your tongue? But it's so earlier in the film, when Hellboy is trying to figure out how to stop Nimue, he is visited by Baba Yaga, or Baba Yaga summons him. I forget how exactly that works. He gets into an elevator and it just drops him into Baba Yaga's dimension. But she basically is we're again implied that there has been a previous fight between these two where he banished her here. And he cut out one of her eyes, basically. And she basically makes him a deal. She's like, I'll tell you where Nimue is, and you give me one of your eyes. And they have to kiss on it, which is very gross scene. But afterwards, she tells him where Nimue is, and then he just kind of leaves. He doesn't give her the eyes. You didn't put a time limit on it, so I don't have to do anything until I'm done. Yeah. Blah, blah, blah. So he just leaves, and she's really mad about that. So the end of this movie is Baba Yaga back in her house, and she's talking to somebody. Now, we're never shown who this is, but basically she wants to get back at Hellboy now for this double cross, and basically tells this unnamed person, you basically stop and kill Hellboy for me, and I will give you that thing you've always wanted. And the guy's basically like, and what is that? And she's like, I'll finally allow you to die. Implying that this person is
the man in the hat from The Amazing Spider-Man.
Yes. Accurately, completely. The crossover you didn't expect. The implication here is that this is supposed to be Koschei the Deathless, who is another character that features into the Hellboy universe. He's from Russian folklore. Hellboy did do a lot of bringing in various aspects. Like Nimue is actually a corrupted version of the Lady in the Lake from the Arthurian legend. That's who Nimue is. So Koschei the Deathless is another guy who comes in, also known as Koschei the Immortal, who lived from 1848 to 1926. So he named himself kind of wrong there, if you ask me. The very fact that he died. But yeah, so he's a guy that's fought Hellboy multiple times. They've had fights where they fail to kill each other. Like, they're both trying to kill the other one, and neither of them can succeed because they're both that tough. But that seemed to be the implication there, is that we're setting up this other Hellboy foe. So whether he's the aforementioned greater threat, who knows? But yeah, so like I said, this movie definitely was hedging its bets on getting to do more, which as of now,
it looks like that is the. I mean, I think Del Toro's Hellboy 3 might be more likely than David Harbour's Hellboy 2 at this point.
Yeah.
But it's likely we don't see Hellboy on the big screen in any form for a very long time. And
Hellboy of Two Worlds, give it to me, guys.
That's multiverse Hellboy. Yeah. That's the popular
it's the cool
thing
thing
right
now.
Everyone's doing it.
Everyone's doing it. Give me two Hellboys, guys.
Andrew, keep in mind that this is a podcast that has to come to an end at some point, but I'm going to ask you this question. This movie, Mike Mignola, like we talked about, wanted to take the franchise in a different direction, something closer to what he envisions as true to the comic book. So we got this ultra-violent, horror-inspired, R-rated Hellboy movie. In your summation, is this a better adaptation of the source material?
This is pulling from a lot of different stories. They're, like, we've already mentioned some of the changes. Like, obviously, the dynamic between Hellboy and his father is very different in this. It's a lot more rough. It's a lot more tough love. It's a lot more pick yourself up, you're fine kind of thing. Or like when you tell your mom you're sick and she's like, I don't believe you. And that's already one change. It's not really going to make or break it for me, because the truth is that Hellboy's father is not alive for most of like the main Hellboy story. He dies pretty early on. I think in the stuff that it's trying to do, it's being fairly faithful. The problem is it's trying to do so much. This is pulling from no less than 4 different Hellboy stories. Like, Hellboy in Mexico is very much the abridged version of what the intro of this film is, or the Hellboy intro in this film is, where we're seeing Hellboy in Mexico doing this. Like, it's a much longer story where Hellboy actually teams up with luchadors to fight vampires, and it's even more awesome because it's literally awesome. Like, it's Hellboy and 3 luchador brothers fighting vampires, and then one of them disappears, and then you get a moment where like Hellboy finds the other brother and he has been turned into a vampire, and they have that final fight very akin to this, and he's got the same name, Kamazataz or something, I don't remember, but that's clearly where that's coming from. And then the main story is pulling from The Wild Hunt, it's pulling from Darkness Calls, it's pulling from The Storm and the Fury. And the thing is those are like the final 3 Hellboy stories. Like, those are like stories before he dies, basically. And it's a very odd thing to try and like do all at once, because there's just a lot of material there. But like, those are the series where like Excalibur comes into play, and like Nimue's big plan comes into play, and like The Wild Hunt is like that whole giant sequence where the Osiris Club betrays him. That's pulled out of one of the issues of The Wild Hunt where he is targeted, and it's pulling from so many different places that you could argue that stuff just doesn't get the time to breathe. And that's kind of the way I've heard this movie described, is it's like 3 movies of material in one film.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's being like, Cosby he's been around comics. He knows his comics. I certainly don't think he's trying to disrespect, or there's no malice here. I think there was just this idea of kind of using those 3 stories as the 3 acts of the film, but they're just so dense. Like, this movie, so much stuff happens in it. Like, you've got Hellboy, you've got the BPRD, you've got Nimue, you've got this Excalibur subplot, you've got the Alice stuff, you've got the
Baba
Alice
Yaga.
subplot, you've got Baba Yaga, you've got the Baba Yaga stuff, and then you've got this final climax, and it's like an 8-act film where every act is like 9 minutes, and it's just it's a lot going on. So as an adaptation, you can, if you've read the comics, you can see all the pieces. You can see all of the things that this movie is pulling in for this, and it just feels like it's a little too much at once. But I don't think it's being done. Certainly nobody is making this movie trying to do it badly. I think there was an idea, and Mignola, Gold, and all of them worked on the story and the script. So I don't think anybody was being disrespectful, but they definitely felt like they were trying to burn through more than they probably should have.
Yeah, I mean, going back to that critic score, 18%. I mean, that's really low. Batman and Robin is 17%. I mean, that's hard to get below 20% on Rotten Tomatoes. It might be a little harsh, but I kind of get it. I mean, we talked about a lot of great scenes in this movie because the action scenes in particular, there's just a lot of good stuff here. There's a lot of good performances. David Harbour rules as Hellboy. It's legit watching for his performance alone. I think personally, I don't want to get too into like how I would quote fix the movie, but I think if this were like a 90-minute action filled wacky horror movie, kind of focusing on the kinetic energy versus all those side plots, I think it would be a little bit easier to digest and maybe a little bit better received.
I mean, what's even more interesting to me too is it's an 18% on Rotten Tomatoes, but the audience score is still only 48%, which means that like even the audiences weren't like out there being like, this is underrated. Like they're really not. They're not really doing that. I think if you culled some of those subplots, like Baba Yaga doesn't need to be in this movie. She's only in this movie to set up future stuff. There's a lot of things like that where I feel like you could have really trimmed it down, made it a lot leaner, and made the story flow a little bit more efficiently. But despite that, like Harbour alone as Hellboy, I think is worth your price of admission. But I mean, if this pops up on a streamer for sure, I mean, even if it's on sale or, full price if you're into that sort of thing. But I think there's stuff to enjoy here a lot, at least from just an imagery perspective, from a performance perspective. I think the chemistry of this cast is really, really good. I think there's fun to be had, but it is definitely long.
Well, I think that does it for us this week. That is Hellboy 2019. David Harbour rules. Daniel Dae Kim rules. Thomas Haden Church rules.
Thomas Haden Church rules. I like Sasha Lane in this movie too. Sasha Lane from Houston, by the way. But
represent.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of fun. Ian McShane obviously is just Ian McShane. He's Ian McShane. What more can you want? But
great cast, and baby Hellboy is cute.
Yes, oddly.
One thing that we say at the end of these episodes, at the very end of these episodes, when I'm talking really fast going through the credits, is if you enjoy our episode, please share it with a friend. And I want to give that a little bit more space to breathe right now as I make that request, because even though I say it so fast in the episode, it's one of the most important things, important messages that I really want to get out there. We are so grateful for the listeners that we have. If you haven't already, jump into that Discord. Come talk with us, talk with other listeners. There's a link in the episode description. But our podcast is growing, and we couldn't be more excited. And the only way that happens is with you sharing our podcast. I mean, people don't just stumble upon podcasts typically. Not very often. It comes from recommendations. It comes from sending links to a friend. So if you enjoyed this episode, which if you're still listening, I hope that means that you did.
Yeah.
Share it to a friend. If you know somebody that saw this movie and might be interested in the conversation, send it to them. Look at our backlog of episodes. We've covered a lot of movies at this point. If any of them stand out and you know somebody that enjoys that movie or thinks they would get something out of it, shoot them a link. We appreciate it more than you know, I promise.
If you know David Harbour, send him the link.
Yes. Daniel Dae Kim. He probably wants to hear what these two random dudes think that he's beautiful.
These two random white guys think.
I think it would make his day. And remember, maybe not every movie is great,
but all movies have greatness.
Thank you to Mark Benavides for singing our theme song. Follow him on Instagram at NotThatMarkAnthony. Thanks to Mitch of Depressed to Impress for the music. Check him out on YouTube and Twitch.tv. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. It's the only way we're going to grow, and we certainly appreciate it. And follow us on social media at BOTRcast. Thank you. Let's jump into it. Here's the story of this movie. I
don't know. That's fun.
The demonic Hellboy works for the BRPD, a secret organization tasked with keeping the supernatural Did I get it backwards?
You put BRPD.
Damn it.
BPRD.
BPRD. Although, to be fair, Andrew, have you ever eaten someone's tongue? Maybe it does work that way.
Okay. Jesus, good lord. But
God,
yeah,
that would be a great title for a movie. Abe and His Amazing Friends. I would.
And who's the Abe? Who knows which Abe it is? It might be Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, could be.
This is the dumbest thing I've ever said.
That'll be post credits.